What do people have against the Jews anyway? Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin. Today I want to talk about anti-Semitism. As an analyst, an observer of world affairs, I can understand prejudice. I understand issues between different races, different ethnicities, challenges in terms of people's personal, individual lived experience. But I really struggle with the concept of anti-Semitism. The fact that it still, despite everything that has happened, exists and is arguably, in the present day, resurging, particularly in Europe. I mean, we don't see, for example, Jewish terrorist groups around the world. We don't see massive nationalist movements affected by, a particular Jewish sect, right? Like it's just not prevalent in one's daily lives. In fact, Jewish people are massively overrepresented in fields of endeavor. I mean, despite making up a tiny fraction of 1% of the world's population, they contribute 25% of the world's Nobel Prize winners. That's science, technology, healthcare, astronomy. Like it's just an enormous contribution to all of our well-being. So I just don't understand the aggression. And so I want to walk with you a bit as I perceive the history of anti-Semitism. And maybe you at home can help me understand this a bit more, okay? So I can intellectually get my head around anti-Judaism during the Roman Empire, right? If we go way back so 500 BC, Cyrus the Great of Persia, the first Archimedes, he helps the Jews return to modern-day Israel and gives them resources to build the temple. And so they've got the next temple, and then the region is absorbed as a Roman province. There are successive revolts. But at least in the context of the Roman Empire, Jews were the only real monotheistic faith. Okay, and I think that's an important distinction in the world, right? At the time, for whatever else you might say for the Romans, they were extremely pluralistic when it came to their polytheistic faiths, right? So they would go into a new region, meet new peoples, conquer new lands, and they would absorb new gods and new deities into their own pantheon, or simply see them as an adaptation of their own gods. So they were very inclusive of new religions. And in the context of a bureaucratic Roman state where you would have to have religion as part of your legal code, it's understandable that a group of people that says, look, all of your gods are false, ours is the only true God, I don't know what you're talking about, we're not going to participate in any of this stuff. I could see why that would be a thorn in the side of a typical Roman bureaucrat. So in that context, I can understand a degree of prejudice because of the sense of bureaucratic frustration that perhaps Romans experienced with the Jewish people, because at the time, monotheism was not the most common form of faith, right, by any stretch. But even then, the Romans did have a respect for Judaism because they respected all old things. And even at the time of the Roman Empire, Judaism was an established, fairly old, if not ancient, faith. So, okay, moving forward, I can understand intellectually, even if I don't approve morally, with what happened around the Renaissance and the establishment of the Spanish Inquisition. I mean, at the time, you'd have all these taxes that were attributed to Marrano Jews, and by converting to Christianity, you no longer had to pay those taxes. So there was a question not so much about Jews, but the sincerity of the conversion, right? Like, okay, well, have they converted really, or are they converting just to get out of these taxes? Now, it was used as an excuse for all kinds of atrocities. This otherwise perceived to be legitimate investigation into the religious practices of former Jews to something that became an outright torturous persecution. And this seems to come up again and again throughout that period, right? What you have is Jews excluded from the traditional roles of power, so the nobility, castellans, that sort of thing, lords, and instead having to be pushed into professions that were considered somehow lesser, so merchants, moneylenders, that sort of thing. And then on top of that, there was given a kind of a religious Christian injunction to those groups because of the fact that you weren't supposed to commit usury, so-called, that is, lending money for interest, whereas monarchs and various lords and other nobles would turn to Jews in order to borrow money, just as you would with a bank today. So I can understand from a sense of prejudice and jealousy and suspicion an anti-Judaistic sentiment at that time, right? But it doesn't make any sense today. And it didn't even in the context of that time, it was clearly about greed. Yes, there was a genuine sense of religious animosity, but it was still, it doesn't even make sense in the context of the time. Like, even back in that period, Jews were not responsible for significant malaise, although they were often scapegoated for things like plagues and other maladies. Moving on to the Renaissance, right? And all of a sudden you've got a significant migration of people from one class to another. You have a significant move from one class to another, and through intermarriage, the rise of the Medicis, the innovations of accounting, double entry bookkeeping, new forms of banking, and all of a sudden the merchant class, of which of course Jews were prominent, suddenly began to rise. And they were expelled from England and other places as a consequence of the debts that monarchs and other governments had in these communities. And so, I can understand the anti-Judaism sentiment, at least from a historical, if not particularly appealing narrative, right? And there was a clear pathway forward for those people. That was, they were supposed to abandon their faith and turn to Christianity, and that there was a various means of persecution to ensure that would happen. And in a world in which there were, kind of three great monotheistic faiths, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, Judaism was, of course, torn between the two giants. So I can understand intellectually that, okay? And then we get into the sort of darker part of history where Judaism morphed into anti-Semitism. And it's such an appalling and painful example of how ideology can possess people and drive to incredibly dark things in the name of some thought to be higher order good. I mean, there was Charles Darwin's theory of evolution in the 19th century, which posited that you were subject to natural selection. That is, that if your environment changed, those most naturally adapted to that environment were more likely to survive and procreate. So, for example, if you're a bird and you have a big beak and all the nuts that are left are nuts with tough shells, then your big beak will give you an advantage in opening up those nuts and accessing the food inside. Ergo, you'll be more likely to pass that particular genetic trait onto your offspring, while those that do not have that natural advantage will die out. And that, across the spans of eons, leads to the entire multiplicity of life that we see around the world today. And as Charles Darwin explicitly states, it's not the strongest, the smartest, the greatest creatures that inherit the earth. It's those best adapted to change. And yet, in a perverse, pseudo-scientific, race-based ideology, that latter part, that core aspect of the theory of evolution was discarded in favor of a concept of social Darwinism that posited that different races were somehow in this apocalyptic struggle to compete with one another, and that the strong, the best, the most dominant would survive. And in the context of that, we saw, of course, the rise of Nazi ideology. And it led to the dehumanization of people that were different to them, that people who weren't blonde hair, blue-eyed, and who, in particular, as you all know, the Jews, and where that ended. And that it's not just where it ended, it's the entire incremental deterioration and degeneration of the human spirit that dehumanized the Jewish people to that point. One of the things that is a bit of an aside, but still similar, that I'm really concerned with is a lot of Jews, I find, really struggle to understand how the Holocaust happened, right? I mean, all the people basically who lived that experience are gone, and who owns the Holocaust today, who are the inheritors of that experience, is now a matter of contestation. Is it the survivors? Definitely. Is it the children of survivors? Is it all Jewish people? Is it the state of Israel? Is it all of the human race? Like, these things are being discussed. But one thing that is certain is that the reason why it seems like, the Holocaust was something that happened without an enormous amount of resistance is because it's the end state of a very long progressive journey. Like, throughout all of history where Jews were persecuted, the approach that was taken to respond was to collectively get together and not rock the boat, right? It's like, okay, well, if everyone thinks that, we're eating children and everything, because of or that we're causing these earthquakes, the best thing to do is to not upset anybody, not draw attention to ourselves, not do anything too radical, and this hysteria will blow over, and we'll just look out for each other in the meantime, and as a consequence from that, everything will be okay. And that's where the true darkness of anti-Semitism came about, because it said that no matter what you did, even if you converted away from the faith, there was something intrinsic about you that was defective, that said that it made you less than a true and complete human being. And as a consequence of that belief structure, it didn't, no amount of accommodation, which was the natural means by which they had, hitherto managed this prejudice, was going to be successful in something as evil and as extreme as of Nazi Germany. So, despite that experience, we are seeing a resurgence of anti-Semitism today. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, the British Labour Party, this is the United Kingdom, the country that was, one of the most responsible for staring down this ideology. United Kingdom itself, for a major political party, had to apologise for the anti-Semitism that was prevalent in its party. I mean, just in 2020, I just find that very hard to understand, that you would need to get to a stage where an environment of anti-Semitism could ever be tolerated. And I struggle intellectually to get my head around it. One thing that has been sort of posited is that's to do with Israel, that after the war, there was a kind of universal acceptance that the state of Israel needed to exist in order to give the Jewish people a home, okay? And that first of all, the lived experience of everyone who was still around, who was a survivor of that experience, helped create sympathy for that project. And also that it was in an incredibly hostile environment, and the hostility of its neighbours gave it the sense that it was fighting to preserve its liberty and its as a nascent and tiny democracy. And if we fast forward to today, there is a broader perception that instead of being a victim, it is somehow the bully, that its power is so much greater than the rest of the region, that it throws its weight around, takes territory that doesn't belong to it, and so forth. And there's a couple of things I want to say about that. Number one, having been there, having been to Israel, a bit, it's astonishing to see this vibrant, modern, Western-style democracy in this incredibly hostile and, frankly, medieval region, right? Like, you can't, just to see a gay pride parade in Tel Aviv, where all the capitals around it, Damascus, Beirut, Cairo, it just doesn't make any sense at all, right? It just seems so unreal, like you're in a dream. And yet it is the preservation of that Western ideal in this incredibly hostile environment that shows that no, Israel is not this all-powerful thing. It is actually got something quite vulnerable to protect. And also the essence of its perceived aggression. Like, it is true that Israel has enormous power, right, in that region relative to many of its neighbours. And despite that power, it is extraordinarily constrained. So yes, it does engage in military action in Gaza and so on, but compared to what it could do, it very much absolutely constrains itself to core military objectives necessary to preserve its national sovereignty and national peace. Israel does not go after people that aren't going after them. That is something that is very clear. And as leaders of Shin Bet and others will tell you, the difficult decision is not to go in and blow things up. The difficult decision is to say no will be restrained. And that's something that you will not see in many of its neighbours, to be frank. So that's my sort of defence of Israel. But all too often, anti-Semitism is masked as anti-Israel, anti-Zionism. For example, if people are attacking Israel in the general, like saying Israel's this, Israel's that, I find it is very common that it is a mask for a broader prejudice against the Jewish people. For example, Iran, right, denies Israel's right to exist, right? And nobody doubts that if it were within Iran's power and it could pay an acceptable price, it would destroy Israel. Does anyone doubt that proposition? Like, even people that sort of say, oh, Israel's at fault, if they stop and think about it, they know that statement to be true. Israel's existence is at the mercy of its own power and that of its supporting allies. Whereas those that are critical of Israel but not anti-Semitic are much more specific. They'll talk about things like Netanyahu's policies in the Golan Heights, that sort of thing, like very specific issues that say, I love Israel, but it's not perfect. And that is perfectly a fair thing to say, as it is for any country and society or any group of people, because it's true. Nothing is perfect, and of course Israel makes mistakes and it has things to be critical about. The beauty of it is in Israel, you can actually say those things without being arrested and disappeared. Whereas if you are in Saudi Arabia, you are going to potentially be executed, even if you're in like some other country, such as in Turkey, where you're a dissident journalist, you might be murdered in a Saudi consulate, right? That doesn't happen in Israel. Even traitors to Israel have been arrested. Even Nazi criminals were found captured, brought to Israel and tried. That's just extraordinary. I mean, that is just, not many countries do that. So I come back to this sort of struggle that despite the experience that we all know that is an affront to the human race, perhaps the most important lesson in world history that any of us could learn, the systematic dehumanization of a people, not because they've done anything, but just because of what they are, it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense to me that these things could happen again and again. Right? I'm not saying that the Holocaust is happening again or even close to happening again, but I am saying that the sentimentality that pushed us along that journey is evident in the world today. And I don't understand why. I could understand anti-Judaism in the Roman Empire. I can understand prejudice and jealousy and envy among the hands of greedy nobles who were in a lot of debt in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I can understand a general religious prejudice for those who see that everyone needs to convert in order to be saved, right? I can understand that. But I cannot understand a systematic prejudice against a group of people because of their inherent traits, okay? Particularly a group of people that don't go around, committing terrorist acts around the world and in fact bequeath to the rest of us an enormous scientific, medical, engineering, literary contribution. I mean, I'll finish with one example. It's probably my favorite book set in the Middle Ages. It was written during the Napoleonic era, but it's an extraordinary historical fiction, and that is Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. If you haven't read it, do yourself a favor. Right after this video, go away and read it. It's an extraordinary story. It's set during the Crusades, where in England, King Richard is off in the Holy Land, and John is in charge, and it follows this disinherited Saxon knight. Okay, so he's a Saxon, but then you have the Norman conquest 150 years earlier. The landed gentry speak French, whilst the natives speak sort of early English. And you follow Ivanhoe, who has been disinherited by his family because he's abandoning his Saxon ways because he wants to be more knightly. And yet the true heroes of this book are not the knights and the nobles and all the pageantry. It's the Jewish characters. Particular this girl Rebecca, who has a highly developed modern sense of morality. So you've got all these knights and their codes of chivalry with a very primitive intellectual, primitive moral sense of shame and honor, brushed up against these Jewish characters who have a much more modern sense of ethics and conscience, and they apply reason and logic to the situations in which they find themselves. I don't want to give anything away about the book, but I think it was the first time we saw truly heroic characters of a Jewish nature in popular fiction at a time when there was still the romance era of the Napoleonic age. So I strongly recommend that. And what was made it so powerful about these characters is that there was a certain sense of awareness of the prejudice against them, that they were always seen as the Jews and the Jewesses, and that they were excluded from this knightly kind of pageantry that existed, and therefore they were forced to develop these modern sensibilities. I know I'm going on a bit, but I found this to be a really powerful mirror to the modern age. And the fact that it is still a mirror 200 plus years later is just painful and outrageous to me. I would love to hear your thoughts on, am I overblowing it? Is it not, is anti-Semitism not resurging? If it is, can you help to explain why? Because I really struggle to do that. And what are the answers? If the Holocaust isn't enough, right? What is? I can understand prejudice towards Islamic groups because of terrorism and so on. Like, I don't necessarily approve of it, but I can intellectually get it. I don't get this one. And so you help me. Please like and subscribe to this channel if you want to have this dialogue and find value in it. Please do so. And as I said, leave your comments down below. I don't have the answers. I just have big questions. Thank you.